Let's get started. So welcome everyone. We're glad you're here with us for today's webinar on creating subregional plans. I'm seeing people from all over, Corte Madera, San Francisco, consultants, government. We have some commissioners here, elected officials. So this is a really great diverse group, and appreciate your attendance, and welcome too if anyone is here from Cal Cities. Jackie, could you move the slide forward, please? Thank you. So I'm Dana Brockwald. I'm the Assistant Planning Director for Climate Adaptation. And today we're going to talk to you about how to create adaptation plans that follow BCC's guidelines in the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan. This is the second in a series of webinars that are designed to support local governments, community organizations, and regional partners as we implement the new planning requirements under SB 272. If you didn't attend the first webinar, which was more of an intro level webinar on what this all is, we encourage you to watch the recording on our website, but it's not a prerequisite. We'll revisit the content that we touched on there in more depth today. So the work that we're going to talk about today builds on years of work and collaboration, including many of you in the webinar today. The Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan was approved last December and was developed through a broad public process that brought together local governments, community organizations, scientists, residents, and many more across the region. And that helped shape the RSAP and the required guidelines for the subregional plans that are in it, which we'll be diving into today. So before we get started, I will introduce the team here. I'm here with Jackie Perrin-Martinez. She's our Climate Adaptation Planning Manager, and Danielle Flanagan, who is our Climate Adaptation Planning Specialist. And shout out to Kat Riley, who is our tech support today. And we're part of the planning team at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, BCDC for short. BCDC is our state agency with planning and regulatory authority over the San Francisco Bay and its shoreline within the 9 counties. So you'll hear from each of us today. Also, just a few quick tech tips and webinar norms. Please use the chat to share your thoughts. We have some audience engagement planned throughout the webinar, and later we'll have a Q&A section, and you can submit your questions. Either you can raise your hand or submit them in the webinar Q&A. If you have any tech issues, please send direct message to our team and we'll help you to troubleshoot. You can send it to any of us and we'll help you out. So here's a quick look at what we'll be covering today. We'll start going over today's goals for the webinar and provide a quick recap of what we covered in the first webinar. Then in part 1 we'll focus on navigating the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan to create your subregional plan. We'll walk through the key sections and the full document so that you can understand how it's organized and where to find what you need. In part 2, we'll break down the required plan elements, which are the core building blocks that every subregional plan needs to include. And part 3 will cover the minimum standards and how they help to create regional consistency while giving local governments the flexibility to design plans that work for your shoreline. Then we'll wrap up with a few key takeaways and leave time at the end for questions and discussion. So our goals here today, first, we want to make sure that you're familiar with the key components of the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan. We want to make sure that you understand the structure of the RSAP guidelines, both the plan elements and the minimum standards. And third, we want you to leave with a solid understanding of what a subregional plan is, how it fits into the broader regional effort, and how the RSAP is designed to support you in developing one. To quickly recap the first webinar in June, we began by grounding ourselves in the challenge. Sea level rise is a complex issue that has impacts across the region, and it's not something that any one community can solve alone. But when we work together, regional collaboration makes us stronger and more effective. That really lays the foundation for the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, or RSAP. We might say both. I know government loves our acronyms. And how the RSAP provides a path forward for developing local subregional plans and meeting the requirements of SB 272. And finally, we talked about BCC's role. We're here as a partner, convener, and a resource to support you on your planning efforts. Our goal is really to make it easier for local governments and communities to take the next steps, and we're committed to help you doing that. So let's quickly revisit a few terms from webinar 1 that will be important for today's discussion. Senate Bill 272, or SB 272, is the state law that requires local governments to develop subregional shoreline adaptation plans. And as part of that law, BCDC was directed to create guidelines for the San Francisco Bay that those plans must follow. And then we have the authority to review and approve or deny completed plans. The Subregional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, or RSAP, is the regional framework developed by BCDC to guide planning for sea level rise in the San Francisco Bay. It includes a regional vision for adaptation, as well as the guidelines that local governments use when developing subregional plans. And the RSAP is really intentionally designed to be flexible so that it can support a wide range of local contexts, priorities, and capacities. And lastly, subregional shoreline adaptation plans, as opposed to regional shoreline adaptation plans, which we might also call subregional plans or just plans, are the sea level rise adaptation plans that are created by cities and counties to meet the requirements under SB 272. And these are the plans that follow the RSAP guidelines and shaped by local goals, conditions, and community input while aligning with and advancing broader regional objectives. So that brings us to part 1, navigating the RSAP to create your plan. First, we'll ground ourselves in what we mean by adaptation and walk through the RSAP itself, looking at how it's structured and what each section covers. If you've looked at it, you'll know that the RSAP is a long document, but it's designed to be walked through in chunks and to be a practical, usable resource for local governments. So our goal for part 1 is to help you understand how to navigate the document and understand how the different sections fit together. So I'll first start with the outline. The Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan is organized into 3 main sections plus an appendix, if you really want to go deep. And each of these sections has a different role in supporting planning. Section 1, the introduction, provides background on why the RSAP was created, who it's for, and how it was developed, as well as the key context for the science of sea level rise and adaptation. Section 2 includes the One Bay vision and strategic regional priorities. In webinar 1, we spent a little bit of time on the intro and One Bay vision, but today we'll go deeper into strategic regional priorities, which help to translate that One Bay vision into more specific regional goals. Section 3 is the plan guidelines. This is the most directly applicable section for local governments, and it outlines the required plan elements and minimum standards that your plans must follow. And the appendix includes supporting resources from technical data to overviews of the process that we followed. So we'll focus mainly on sections 2 and 3 today, with particular attention to how they support and guide local planning efforts. But the one thing I do want to start with is something in section 1 is what is sea level rise adaptation, just so we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about. And in RSAP, adaptation refers to the actions, could be physical or non-physical, that a community or government takes to reduce risks from a hazard. And in our case, that hazard is sea level rise and coastal flooding. We talk in the RSAP about adaptation strategies that fall into a few categories. First is accommodate, which means modifying existing systems or structures to reduce their risk. For example, elevating buildings or infrastructure to stay above flood levels. We talk about protect strategies, which refers to building barriers between people and water. These are things like traditional seawalls, but could also include nature-based solutions like ecotone levees that combine habitat and protection. We also talk about avoid or relocate. They're different approaches, but they result in a similar outcome, which is keeping people and assets out of harm's way through land use planning or zoning. And then lastly, we talk about prepare strategies, which includes non-structural strategies like public education, emergency planning, and communication. These are the things that build resilience before disaster strikes. And all 4 of these approaches can be part of an adaptation plan. The right mix for you will depend on local priorities, community input, shoreline conditions, and your long-term goals. So setting that context, let's jump into section 2. This includes 2 key components. The first is our One Bay vision. This offers a big picture view of what successful sea level rise adaptation could look like across the Bay Area, one that's resilient, equitable, and coordinated across communities. And the second part, what we'll focus on today, is our strategic regional priorities. These priorities make the vision actionable. So strategic regional priorities are critical region-wide issues that will be exacerbated by sea level rise, but that must be addressed locally to reduce or avoid consequences regionally. The 8 strategic regional priorities emerged directly from the One Bay vision and include things like reducing displacement, protecting baylands habitats, maintaining critical services, and improving shoreline access. Strategic regional priorities guide local planning while ensuring efforts align across jurisdictions. And if a strategic regional priority is present in your community, they must be addressed in local plans. Because these priorities are deeply interconnected, addressing them effectively requires collaboration that goes beyond business as usual. But together, they'll offer a clear path forward to a more coordinated, equitable, and resilient shoreline. So here's an example of one of the strategic regional priorities: clean communities to improve environmental justice. This priority focuses on reducing the risk of contamination in frontline communities, especially those with a history of environmental burdens. So if your shoreline contains a mapped contaminated site in an environmental justice community, your subregional plan must address it. This means clearly showing how the site's being considered and what steps you're taking to reduce the risks as part of your adaptation strategy. So each priority comes with a corresponding adaptation strategy standard. We'll talk about those later. And the adaptation strategy standard outlines what's required if you have that strategic regional priority in your community. So this ensures consistency across the region and how these issues are approached, but still allows room for local context. So let's take a pause here and hear from you. Of the priorities that we have discussed, and Kat will put them in the chat as well, which one feels most urgent in your community or work? This could be things like reducing displacement, protecting baylands habitats, improving shoreline access, etc. So please drop your answer in the chat and let's wait a moment to see what is top of mind for everyone. They are all equally important. That's why we included all of them, yes. Okay, so we're starting to use cross-jurisdictional flood risk reduction. Yep, safe and strategic growth and density. Great. Keep them coming. Getting a lot of votes for that cross-jurisdictional flood risk reduction. Great. Wonderful. Keep sharing. We definitely are going to come back to this chat and look and see what you all are thinking, but it's really helpful for us to hear what priorities feel most urgent. And this helps us understand what matters to you in your community and helps us meet you where you are better. This also highlights why a clear, consistent planning framework is so important across the region to address these cross-cutting topics that everybody cares about. So now let's turn to section 3 of the RSAP, which outlines the plan guidelines. This is the part of the document that lays out the requirements that local governments must use to develop your subregional plans that comply with SB 272. Oh, my screen just got weird. It's not a webinar without some tech issues. There we go. So this section breaks down the what and how of subregional plans to help make the plan development process easier to understand, so you don't spend all your time figuring out how to make your plan rather than considering the best outcome for your community. Tech issues again. Hold on one second. Okay, so section 3.1 defines what a subregional shoreline adaptation plan is and offers flexible pathways so jurisdictions can build on your existing efforts. Sections 3.2 and 3.4 are where the main requirements for creating plans can be found. 3.2 outlines the 7 key plan elements labeled A through G that guide the full planning process. We'll get into those a little bit more later. Section 3.3 is the minimum standards, which are the criteria that ensure every plan is consistent, equitable, and based on sound science. 3.4 provides a complete plan checklist to help local governments confirm that your plans include all the required elements and meet the standards before submission to BCDC. And 3.5 explains the process for plan development, submission, approval, and updates. So for today's webinar, we're primarily going to focus on the first 4 subsections to give you practical guidance for how to build your subregional plan. And then at our September webinar, we'll cover more of section 3.5 to go over the formal process and how you submit your plans. And lastly, the appendix provides key supporting information on plan guidelines, describes the technical foundation by describing the data, methods, and flood hazard modeling behind the RSAP. It documents our equity strategy, showing how equity and environmental justice were integrated throughout the RSAP process, and it outlines the process, the outreach process during the creation of the plan. And finally, it offers some planning recommendations, suggesting additional hazards and assets that jurisdictions might consider beyond the minimum standards. This information exemplifies that the RSAP is grounded in solid science, equity, and community input. So with that foundation in place for what the RSAP is, let's turn to the heart of the RSAP, the Section 3 plan guidelines, and dive into each one of the plan elements in more detail. I'll hand it over now to Jackie, who will walk us through the elements that make up a complete subregional plan.
Great, thank you, Dana. So hi everyone, as a reminder, I'm Jackie Perrin-Martinez. I'm the Climate Adaptation Planning Manager, and I'm excited to dive into the plan elements as they really are the core of the RSAP guidelines, and they support you throughout your planning process. They outline what every subregional plan should include, from community engagement and assessment to strategies, implementation, and identifying priority projects. So as Dana mentioned, Section 3 is the most detailed and practical part of the RSAP. It includes the guidelines that local governments must follow when developing their plans. For this part of the webinar, I'm going to focus on sections 3.1 and 3.2, which are highlighted here, and then I'll pass it over to Danielle to talk through the next 2, which are sections 3.3 and 3.4. It's important to note that these sections are connected and they work together. We'll discuss these one by one to help break it all down, though I'll point out some key connection points, particularly where our 4 minimum standards are referenced in the plan elements. So in these 2 sections that I'll discuss, we'll define what subregional plans are and who's required to make one, and then I'll walk you through the required planning elements that make up the core of the plan itself. Section 3.1 defines what subregional shoreline adaptation plans are and who's required to make one. Subregional plans are locally created sea level rise adaptation plans that follow the guidelines in the RSAP. All local governments, which means cities and counties within BCDC's jurisdiction, are required to create a plan as mandated by SB 272. And I'll provide a list of those jurisdictions in the next slide. Plans can be created for a single jurisdiction or multiple jurisdictions. The choice is yours and what makes sense for your communities. We know that not all plans will look the same. Local shorelines and local risks look different. The plan guidelines seek to add consistency to the planning process by creating a unified framework. For local governments that have already done a lot of work, we encourage you to build upon your existing studies, plans, and resources. This means citing existing materials by reference where they meet plan requirements. We require up to 3 consultation meetings with BCDC staff. Actually, I should say we require a minimum of 3 consultation meetings with BCDC staff during your plan development to support you in creating your plans, though we can be available for more. These meetings give you a chance to check in with us, ask questions, and stay aligned with the requirements. Altogether, subregional plans are the vehicles for not only identifying adaptation strategies, but driving implementation of those strategies that are coordinated with your neighbors and contribute to a region-wide strategy for resilient shorelines. So who is required to create a plan? Section 3.1 includes this table with a breakdown of the cities and counties. A few cities in this table you might see are starred, meaning that they are not within BCDC's jurisdiction and therefore not required to create a plan. However, they are impacted by early flood hazards, so we encourage them to consider creating one. You might notice that this table does not include a whole range of other stakeholders. For example, special districts, key landowners, state and federal agencies, and more. SB 272 specifically requires cities and counties to develop and get these subregional plans approved. And while local governments have a key role to play, we know that they shouldn't go it alone. So we encourage you, all the local governments on this call, to partner with all of your local stakeholders, hopefully many others on this call, to develop plans that are comprehensive and inclusive. The benefit is that adaptation projects within approved plans are prioritized for state funding. So for example, this means that if a special district partners with a city to get its adaptation strategies integrated into a subregional plan, those projects can also get access to this funding. So speaking of funding and costs, we've heard a request from many of you to help local governments understand the costs of creating a subregional plan. We've created a resource that outlines estimated cost of creating a subregional plan, organized by cost per element for both single jurisdictions and multiple jurisdictions. We've posted this resource online. We have it available for you now, and we'll point it out in the chat now as well as at the end of the webinar. All right, so now that we've covered who needs to create a subregional plan, let's talk about what goes into one. Section 3.2 of the RSAP breaks down the 7 plan elements that contain the requirements for a subregional plan. This slide provides a conceptual overview of those elements. Element A can be thought of as the overarching documentation of the process. It is complete only when the full plan is complete. Elements B and C help you understand the local content and conditions of vulnerability. Then elements D through G focus on selecting and advancing adaptation strategies that respond to your local risks and values while also advancing regional goals. We'll first explore elements A to C that build a foundation, followed by D through G that turn planning into action. So diving deeper into the first 3 plan elements, this is where you make sure your process is inclusive, your baseline is clear, and your plan is grounded in a strong understanding of local risks. Element A is where you describe your planning process, including how the plan was developed, who was involved, how coordination happened, and how equity and community engagement were built into the work. It's your chance to show that the process was collaborative and thoughtful from the beginning. Throughout your planning process, we also require an equity assessment. This is one of our 4 minimum standards to ensure that equity is integrated throughout all aspects of your plan. We'll discuss this standard in more detail in our next section. Next, element B is existing conditions. This includes documenting what's on the ground today. Things like physical features, ecological systems, land uses, key assets, and policies already in place. It gives you a clear starting point for understanding local vulnerabilities and future planning needs. Here, we also list minimum required assets that we want you to look at. This is another one of our minimum standards. And then element C is the vulnerability assessment. This is where you look at who and what is at risk from sea level rise and flooding, including people, infrastructure, and ecosystems. This is also where those strategic regional priorities Dana mentioned earlier are really folded in and integrated more deeply into your plan. This element helps you understand where action is needed most. This section requires analysis of a consistent set of flood hazards and sea level rise scenarios, which we spell out in one of our minimum standards as well to ensure consistency. Together, these 3 elements create a strong foundation for the rest of your plan and ensure that it's grounded in both local knowledge and regional priorities. So now let's move on to the next section, the next kind of half of the plan elements, which is focused on moving from planning to action. The first step is identifying your adaptation strategies. This is key to the whole plan. This is really what we want you to do. The requirements here include identifying both physical and non-physical solutions, including policy solutions, to reduce flood risk and support your community's local vision and the regional One Bay vision. To guide the selection of adaptation, we have adaptation strategy standards that describe the outcomes that we want adaptation to achieve while allowing local governments the flexibility to choose specific strategies to get them there. Plans should prioritize nature-based approaches and be phased over time to allow for flexibility as conditions change. Once you know what strategies you're pursuing, the next step is element E, to consider the land use and policy changes needed to support them. This could include zoning updates, overlay districts, or other tools to help ensure your adaptation strategies are effective and lasting. From there, you'll need element F, which is an implementation plan. This clearly lays out who's responsible for each action, when it will happen, how it will be funded, and how you'll track progress over time. This section helps turn your strategies into a realistic, accountable path forward. And finally, each plan includes an optional element G, the project list. If you have strategies detailed enough to be considered a project, this is where you would add them. This is a catalog of priority adaptation projects that can help with regional tracking, coordination, and funding opportunities. Elements D to G are where the plan becomes truly actionable. They help connect vision to execution and ensure your strategies are grounded in real-world timeliness, policies, and resources. All right, so I know that was a lot. So now we want to turn it back to you. Which part of turning an adaptation strategy into action feels most challenging in your community? You can type in 1 or 2 words in the chat. For example, maybe it's funding, zoning, coordination, timeline. I'll give you a few moments to share your thoughts, and as always, continue to kind of add them in even once we move on from the slide. Okay, a lot on funding. These are great. Definitely a clear answer that funding is a very big challenge. Talking about big changes, land use, coordination, regulatory alignment between BCDC and other regulators, natural and nature-based adaptation and equity, and coordination. These are great. I'm just want to give more time for people to answer them. All right, so I will move us on, but as always, please continue to add them a little bit more to the chat. So it's clear that turning strategies into action can involve lots of hurdles. We heard very loud and clear, funding is a big one, coordination, equity, big changes. And something we want to make clear is that our aim in the RSAP guidelines is to help local governments address these challenges by integrating them across a standardized process, though we know that it won't solve all issues. So for the things that remain, our program at BCDC and the support we give to local governments, we intend to continue exploring how we can support you in addressing these challenges so that together we can continue advancing adaptation planning across the region. All right, with that, so now that we walked through the 7 plan elements that form the basic structure of each subregional plan, the next question is, how do we make sure these plans are consistent across the region and meet shared goals? So I'll now turn it over to Danielle to walk us through this next section on minimum standards.
Thanks, Jackie. Hi, everyone. As a reminder, I'm Danielle Flanagan. I'm the Climate Adaptation Planning Specialist. To help you understand how the RSAP really creates consistency and how to incorporate it into your plan, I'm going to walk you through the next section, section 3. So you've seen this slide a few times now. I'm going to dive into section 3.3, which covers the minimum standards, and then section 3.4, which covers the subregional plan checklist. So the minimum standards are the essential requirements that every subregional plan must meet. These standards provide a consistent foundation for planning and are referenced throughout the plan elements that we covered in the last section. There are 4 key standards. First, the coastal flood hazards and sea level rise scenarios, which require using regionally accepted data for flood and sea level rise projections. Second is the minimum categories and assets, meaning your plan needs to include key infrastructure, communities, and ecosystems. And then third, the equity assessment, which ensures you evaluate impacts on vulnerable populations and integrate equity throughout the planning process. Finally, we have the adaptation strategy standards, which really make sure your chosen strategies are practical, effective, and really promote long-term resilience. These standards really help maintain consistency across the region and establish a regional baseline and ensure that the plans are scientifically sound and equity focused. In the following slides, I'm going to guide you through each one of these 4 standards in a little bit more detail. Awesome. So the first minimum standard is the coastal flood hazards and sea level rise scenarios. This standard requires looking at 4 types of coastal flooding affected by sea level rise. That includes tidal inundation, a 100-year storm surge, emergent groundwater, and shallow groundwater. And it tells us which sea level rise scenarios to use for planning, specifically projections for 2050 plus 3 different scenarios for 2100. You will need to assess all 4 hazards at each sea level rise scenario. So for the 2050 projection, you'll look at all 4, and the same goes for 2100 scenarios. These coastal flood hazards and sea level rise scenarios directly shape how your subregional plan and are used in element A, C, D, and E. But why does this matter? So one challenge in the Bay Area is that different places use different flood hazards or water levels in their planning. That makes it really hard to coordinate across jurisdictions. This standard really solves that by setting the same foundation so plans are easier to align regionally. I also want to note that these are just the minimum standards. Jurisdictions can always go beyond this as well. Next, let's look at the minimum categories and assets. Planning and developing adaptation strategies, as we asked you to do in element D, requires really assessing a range of important assets that could be affected by sea level rise. The minimum categories and asset standards really help set a consistent regional baseline for identifying and protecting critical resources that range from physical to social to environmental and economic. This standard is really designed to help governments understand what's required and ensure nothing important is overlooked. You'll see a snapshot here of the type of assets you'll need to consider in your plan. About 70 to 80% of the data on these required categories and assets lists are going to be available in the RSAP Atlas, which is launching in early August and will be the focus of our next webinar. For the 10 to 20% of data that we don't include in the Atlas, there is a lot of flexibility in filling the gaps if local data is just unavailable or it's sensitive. This really allows you to adjust your approach while still meeting the requirements. This standard also applies across several plan elements, including existing conditions, the vulnerability assessment, and adaptation strategies. While every plan must meet these minimum standards, local governments are really encouraged to go beyond them. And we've included recommended approaches and example assets in the appendix to support that. The third minimum standard is the equity assessment. This is really about understanding who benefits from your plan and, just as importantly, who might be burdened by it. The goal is to make sure adaptation strategies don't unintentionally reinforce or worsen existing inequalities. It also ensures that local values, community priorities, and input from frontline populations really help shape decisions from the start. So unlike some of our other standards, this one applies across all planning elements because equity isn't just one part of the process, it really needs to be embedded throughout the process. The final minimum standard is the adaptation strategy standards. This is a set of 20 standards that define what effective, equitable, and regionally aligned adaptation should look like. They cover a range of topics from flood risk reduction and equity to land use, funding, nature-based solutions. You'll use these in element D when selecting your adaptation strategies. They'll really help evaluate trade-offs, ensure consistency, across jurisdictions and connect local actions back to that one Bay vision. Local governments still have the flexibility to choose their own strategies. We're not telling you which ones. These standards are here to guide the outcomes those strategies should meet. And it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. Jurisdictions can decide how to meet each standard based on their local context. Some apply across the board, while others only apply in very specific cases. So that wraps up section 3.3 and the 4 minimum standards. Now I'm going to just touch on section 3.4, which covers the submittal checklist. This checklist is designed to really help you confirm that your plan is complete and meets all of the RSAP requirements. It walks you through each required plan element and ensures that your responses to the equity assessment and the adaptation strategy standards are clearly addressed. It's really a tool to support consistency and completeness before submission and to really help avoid any delays during that process. Even so, though, early coordination with us is really key. We really encourage you to meet with BCDC staff to ensure your plan is headed in the right direction to be considered complete. So now let's review the key takeaways from today's webinar so we can get to those Q&A section. So first, the RSAP really advances social, environmental, and economic resilience, which are essential to local and regional success. Next, the RSAP guidelines really set clear but flexible requirements for subregional plans so you can build on your existing work while still meeting SB 272. 3, there are 4 minimum standards that every plan needs to meet. These ensure that planning across the Bay Area is consistent, science-based, and focused on equitable planning. Finally, subregional plans are local plans that connect on-the-ground actions to the broader regional vision for a resilient and equitable Bay shoreline. These takeaways really summarize the foundation you'll be building on as you develop your own subregional plan. So as a reminder, BCDC is really here to partner with you at every step of the way. We offer consultation meetings at any stage you're planning to talk. We have staff members assigned to each county to be your go-to person for questions, which we call subregional liaisons. We offer 30-minute office hour appointments if you just want to ask a live question. We have a growing set of resources on our website. We're also launching a platform known as the RSAP Atlas that has 70 to 80% of that data you need to complete a plan, which is, again, what our next webinar is, so make sure you join that one. And we have a data-driven dashboard that provides up-to-date data about sea level rise adaptation in the San Francisco Bay region, known as the Bay Adapt Currents. All of the resources mentioned here are linked on the slide, and we're going to post these after on our website. So before we open it up for your questions, we want to leave you with a few quick next steps. This is the second webinar in the summer series, and as I mentioned, the next one is the RSAP Atlas. After that, we'll walk through how to get started with developing subregional plans, including coordination, some funding, early steps, and given that that was a lot of concerns earlier, please also register for that one. Both registrations are open. Additionally, as Jackie mentioned earlier, we have a new resource. This document provides guidance on the cost associated with developing plans and includes estimated ranges of different plan elements. And with that, I will pass it back to Jackie to lead us in Q&A.